Rome's first king was Romulus. First, he laid out the foundations of the city, he marked out its sacred boundaries, set out its laws, assembled its leading men into something resembling a senate. But after that, one story runs that he was literally torn apart by a group of angry nobles for the crime of thinking himself above their station. However, soon after this, a respectable new Roman proclaimed that Romulus visited him on the road in an apparition and announced to that man that he was ascending back to his divine home in the heavens. And so it was decided that Romulus had become a god. The citizens, maybe in compunction for their communal crime, they worshipped him thereafter, and they did so under a new name, Quirinus. There seems to be a certain pattern whereby a great visionary founder becomes increasingly resented in his lifetime, then he dies or at least vanishes, often by the hands of the people that he served, and then he becomes recognized as something greater than human, even by those very same people who cheered on his destruction. The life of Julius Caesar offers one of the best documented examples. In Caesar's final years on Earth, we see the whole process in its tragic splendor, beginning to unfold even within his lifetime in painful detail. Was Caesar a tyrant who aimed to subvert the Republic? Or was he the man who, more than anyone in his lifetime, took on the great burden of care for the whole of the Roman polity? Was he a dangerous egomaniac, obsessed with his own glory? Or was he a man of profound vision who saw what was needed, what was best for his people before anyone else could? Could he have been, perhaps, both? I'll let you decide. I'm Alex Petkus. You are listening to The Cost of Glory, where in our pursuit of classical excellence, we make it our mission to retell the lives of the greatest men of Greece and Rome, and every now and then to wonder, is it possible to become greater than a man? We follow the lead of the ancient philosopher-biographer Plutarch. This is part 3, the final chapter of our series on the life of Julius Caesar. First, I want to thank you for your patience if you've been waiting several months for this episode. But this was a big one, as you can tell from the length, and it took a lot of work because Caesar's final year or two is one of the best documented time frames in the whole of pre-modern history. And I always do my best to go through all the relevant ancient sources, at least the main modern debates as far as I can manage. And I'll talk more about the sources and that kind of thing in the wrap-up episode that I'm currently working on for later. But the upshot is practically every event, every point herein discussed is presented by multiple ancient sources, often very many, often in quite conflicting ways. And people have fought vigorously over their interpretation basically ever since they happened. So, since we're going to present many of these events from other angles in our other lives, remaining in this great Visions of Caesar series, Brutus, Cicero, Antony, Octavius, our objective here is to try to see Caesar's final months, his final days, from his own perspective. Before we get there, I want to very quickly mention another thing that I have been working on. In the past few months, I have started a new endeavor. It is a business network for guys who have seen some success and want to connect and build with other men who are devoted to the ideal of classical excellence. We call it the Classical Society. I'm partnering with my friend and colleague, Ben Wilson of How to Take Over the World podcast as well. We've got several dozen members already, and we are adding more quickly, doing live person events, online courses for going deeper in the classics, and most especially, we are honing the art of rhetoric for practical life. If you think you might be a good fit, I think you're going to love it. Go to theclassicalsociety.com for more details, including a link on that website for how to apply. Let's get on with it. So then, by the end of the war in Africa, against the senatorial holdouts, Julius Caesar has been under arms for more than 12 years continuously. He knows war now, probably better than any man alive. But he gets back to Rome on July 25th, 46 BC. and he meets a challenge harder than any he's ever faced. How do you put the pieces of a state and peacetime society back together after 3.5 years of civil bloodshed? The only man in Roman history who dealt with anything comparable was Sulla, after the civil war in Caesar's teenage years. Sulla's solution was basically to reaffirm the Republican Constitution, or an older, imagined version of it, shore up the oligarchy, tottering as it was, and then exile or execute the remainder of his political opponents. And how did that work out? Well, some of his brightest protégés, Pompey and Crassus, undid Sulla's signature legislation in less than a decade after Sulla's death, and they did that using good old Republican legislative politics, let's not forget. And despite their ballooning net worths, the old family aristocracy, if anything, they are less competent and more corrupt now, even than they were in Sulla's day. It's not like Sulla improved the stock or the morale of the ruling classes of Rome. The provinces are now more sprawling and every bit as abused by their administrators. The risk of native rebellions and strongman politician generals using such occasions to build up an independent power base among the increasingly far-flung legions. Well, Caesar knows better than anyone how that game is still open to worthy contestants. But he also knows it's bad for the entire civilized Roman world for things to keep going on this way. And now, after the recent years of civil war, the chaos in the streets of Rome, the depredations, confiscations, the outright banditry all over Italy, there are so many problems to address. Caesar has forceful and creative solutions to propose. But for now, it was good to let the people celebrate. They've suffered so much. So Caesar gets busy planning the greatest party the world has ever seen. For all he's accomplished, mind you, he's still never celebrated a triumph. He's been imagining this day for almost 15 years, hasn't he? Ever since Cato blocked that triumph of his back in 60 BC before Caesar's first run for consul. Pompey, dear Pompey, had 3 triumphs spread out over his career. Caesar knocks out 4, all in a row, over 11 record-smashing days. First, there's the triumph over the Gauls. Roman commoners finally get to cast their eyes upon Vercingetorix of the Arverni, the champion of the Celtic race, followed by the vast, glittering splendor of their captured noble arms and the haunting idols of the barbarian gods. Vercingetorix is paraded into the forum to the foot of the Capitoline and ritually strangled as an offering to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, as one does. Then there is the golden river of plunder from Caesar's victory over the Nile in triumph number 2. Imagine it. Gilded figures of Amun-Ra and Horus, shining obsidian statuettes, the black jackal Anubis, Thoth, the trickster Ibis, humble Bess, the terracotta dwarf. And the wealth, the exotic marbles from the mines in the eastern desert, the jewels, the precious metals. Also riding along in the Egyptian triumph was a large replica of the famous lighthouse of Alexandria, as well as 2 life-sized effigies of Pothinus, the eunuch, and Achillas, the Alexandrian general, the poor deceased pharaoh Ptolemy's bad advisors who Caesar crushed in the war. These images are seen sitting atop a spectacular, specially crafted parade float, plated with glossy tortoiseshell, an exotic material now seen for the first time here in Rome. But the most eye-catching feature of the procession was the captured dynast Arsinoe. We didn't mention her in our last episode, but she rebelled against her older sister Cleopatra late in the Alexandrian War and lost. And out of respect for the girl's sister, the new unchallenged queen of Egypt, Cleopatra, and the mother of his only natural son, Caesar spares Arsinoe the strangling, and he lets her go off into a dignified exile. Cleopatra, by the way, is in Rome herself by this point. She's recently arrived from Egypt with their now 2-year-old boy, Caesarion. Cleopatra is not able to enjoy the festivities because foreign heads of state, by ancient custom, are not allowed within the sacred city limits, that is, within the bounds of the Pomerium. But conveniently, Caesar has constructed a giant villa on the Janiculum Hill, which is on the other side of the Tiber, and she's installed there with her retinue. It's probably best that a dignified lady like Cleopatra was absent, really, because the triumph was accompanied by the usual raunchy songs of the soldiery. The men are allowed on this one holy day to rib their imperator with locker room abandon. One of their songs went like this. Please cover your children's ears. Urbani servatuxores, moicum calvaducimus, aurin Gallia futuisti, hixum sisti mutuum, which means something like this. Citizens, lock your wives away, the big bald banger's here to stay. Roman gold he took to Gaul, on Celtic girls he blew it all. It is said that similar carols were sung in honor of Cleopatra and Caesar's special friendship. But to our relief, the details are not recorded. Yes, best that Cleopatra not be there for that. But as the Queen of the Nile stood in the gardens of that grand villa on the Janiculum, the Horti Caesaris, the gardens which Caesar later bequeathed in his will to the people of Rome, Cleopatra and her handmaidens could still hear the trumpets, the cheers of the crowd, watching the triumphs, watching unprecedented huge gladiatorial games after that, mock naval battles, wild beast hunts, where for the first time in Rome, giraffes were seen and slaughtered. They could also smell the burnt offerings of the sacrifices and the odor of the lavish meat piles laid out on 22,000 tables. For the discerning palates of every tanner, tailor, pork merchant, and bird cage builder of Rome, the menu was paired with a selection of 4 different fine wines, each of a distinctive terroir, all paid for by the personal generosity of Gaius Julius Caesar, Rome's greatest dictator. Now, if Cleopatra stayed up late enough, she might be able to hear, or even smell, the 40 war elephants which escorted Caesar back to his house after each day's festivities. To his official house, that is, in the center of Rome, where he was eager to be seen officially residing with his legitimate official wife, Calpurnia. Caesar would expect a political woman like Cleopatra to understand one has to keep up appearances. And then there was also the Asian triumph, number 3, over Mithridates' son, Pharnaces. The placard with the famous saying, Veni Vidi Vici, was seen here. Given the geographical proximity of that victory commemorated, this triumph was probably the one where his soldiers sang a song referring to Caesar's youthful adventures with the king of Bithynia, which is also in Asia Minor. It ran, Caesar subdued Gaul, but Nicomedes subdued Caesar, and so on. And Caesar lost his cool a little bit over this one. You know, there are lines you just don't cross. A few days later, he takes a public oath denying that there was any truth in the allegation that he had played the queen to King Nicomedes. And then finally there was, number 4, the African triumph. Now, in none of these triumphs did Caesar make any mention or depiction of Pompey, poor Pompey, and the Battle of Pharsalus. And officially, a triumph is over foreign enemies. So this one was technically a celebration of Caesar's defeat of King Juba of Numidia. But it was also customary to parade big paintings in a triumph, depicting the scenes of victory for the illiterate masses, and somehow the decision was made to carry in the African triumph some images of his optimate opponents, Metellus Scipio stabbing himself to death, Cato the Younger ripping out his intestines like a savage beast in his final minutes on earth. It is said that the spectators upon seeing this could be heard groaning loudly. It's a little strange that Caesar did this. I mean, he's such a master of propaganda. Wasn't this pointless retaliation likely to stir up discontent? Especially since he's been working to put the civil war behind him. After the African War ended, Caesar was presented with a chest containing the personal dossier of Metellus Scipio, containing, no doubt, correspondence with many of the leading men in Rome, expressing their support for Metellus if he should somehow defeat Caesar. And that correspondence was now incriminating. Caesar could use it to root out the duplicitous among his flatterers in Rome. But Caesar followed the example of Pompey, set after the Sertorian War, and he had the chest burned without ever looking at its contents. So with this parade of gruesome paintings in the triumph, Metellus and Cato killing themselves, maybe we see a sign of Caesar's lingering frustration that prominent men kept on fighting against the inevitable, even after the moral victory was essentially settled at Pharsalus. Or maybe Caesar felt that, to firmly ground the new order he's establishing, it would be useful to allow people a little bit of public catharsis, to come to terms with the real tragedy of everything that happened, and to remind them of the dangers of reviving civil strife and let them move on. Still, in the eyes of many of Rome's patriots, the Civil War was kind of a suicide of the Republic. And here it was being symbolically depicted with the violent self-extermination of one of its most celebrated men, Cato. And Caesar had to know how many good men were watching and felt a quiet revulsion at seeing their hero paraded like this. Quiet is the key word here, because Caesar is facing a new kind of problem in Rome. He had a taste of it in Alexandria, because with him as the new unquestioned center of the Roman solar system, despite his strenuous emphasis on clemency, people are afraid now to speak against him. The usual quarrels and challenges which vent competitive aggression are now suddenly closed off to a class of people so unaccustomed to restraint on their opinions. And so in private conversations, hidden from the dictator's ear, the resentment begins to fester. No matter how just your cause, fighting a civil war by necessity involves the subjugation and even slaughter of many good and decent men. There wouldn't be a civil war if both sides didn't have some plausible claim to justice. This great waste is always painful for someone who admires excellence. But there are many such good men of the former opposition who survive now at Rome. And Caesar throughout his career has always worked strenuously to win over the moderates to his program. And now the work is more urgent than ever. In one of his first speeches before the Senate, Caesar insists on his official line that he only fought the civil war to defend his honor, and his only desire now is to restore peace and dignity to the Republic and to set it on a stable footing once again. He tells the senators, "I wish not to be your master, but your champion, not your tyrant, but your leader. When it comes to avenging personal injuries, I will not act as dictator or even as consul, but only as a private citizen." And in all of his addresses and his conversations, he speaks of Pompey only in tones of reverence, tinged with sadness at the misunderstanding brought about by a faction of hostile men who played the two friends against each other. In a fit of popular fervor, the Romans recently tore down the statues of Pompey and Sulla. Caesar has them set back up in their rightful place. Cicero observed this action and declared, "Caesar, in setting up the statues of Pompey, you are firmly planting your own." And the orator Cicero is Rome's greatest surviving politician, besides Caesar. He is the living symbol of the old Senate, and he was exactly the sort of moderate Caesar aimed to influence with his reconciliation policies. Caesar's got sort of literary lieutenants, you might say, among his officer corps, men like Aulus Hirtius, who wrote the final book of the Gallic War commentaries after Caesar's death, and Cornelius Balbus, the closest thing to Caesar's chief of staff. And these guys are working crazy hours to build a mood of hope and optimism among just such depressed and disaffected Optimate sympathizers as Cicero. Rome will be Rome, the Republic will endure, they insist. Hirtius is now even taking rhetoric lessons from Cicero, a clear gesture to Cicero that not only is Caesar eager to have Cicero part of the new order, but that the Republic will stand. Because, as Cicero pointed out in a recent treatise, oratory can only flourish in a free state. And this PR policy seems to be working. Even in many private letters to his friends, Cicero can be heard to speak well of the dictator as a most gentle man, doing his best in the circumstances. True, Cicero wished that they could go back to the days before the Civil War happened, and there were miscreants like Mark Antony and Cicero's wayward son-in-law, Dolabella, swaggering around the forum, calling shots. But Cicero excused even this obscenity. And he wrote to one Optimate friend, "It is not the fault of the victor, who is as moderate as could be, but of the victory itself. For in civil war, victory is always insolent." And Cicero is trying hard to abstain from politics these days. He's retiring to his country estates to engage in what ended up being the greatest philosophical translation project history had ever seen, bringing over Greek philosophy into the Latin language. It's a flurry of activity that resulted in more than 1,000 pages of Cicero's philosophical dialogues, that most of which survive today. However, Caesar desperately wants the orator in Rome, in the Senate, to help him smooth over the rough seas of elite opinion. And Cicero finally obliges Caesar in a cause that would have made most people in Caesar's position squirm with discomfort. He goes to make a plea in the Senate for clemency on behalf of one of the old war hawks, Marcellus, who fought against Caesar at Pharsalus. Many in the Senate will remember how Marcellus, when he was the consul in 51, was one of the loudest voices arguing Caesar should be recalled from his Gallic command early to face whatever legal assaults his enemies might hatch on him at Rome. A proper plea for Marcellus would have to dig up all the old debates the war had settled, all the pain Caesar was trying to assuage now. But Cicero nailed it. In his speech, he concedes that, true, Marcellus fought for the Optimates in the war, but like many of the survivors now present, Cicero included, it was not that Marcellus wanted war, but that he was concerned for the integrity of law. And yet, where exactly the best claims of law and justice lay at the time was a genuinely difficult matter for well-intentioned men to determine. Cicero said, quote, "Many hesitated as to the best course, many as to what was most expedient for themselves, many as to what was the most decent course of action. Some, too, hesitated as to what was lawful. The Republic went through to the bitter end with this wretched war with which fate burdened it. The conqueror, however," he means Caesar, "was not one to let his success kindle his hatred, but rather to let his innate kindness mollify it. He was not one to judge that all who had once deserved his anger were now deserving also of exile or of death." End quote. It was fate, then, that brought this tragedy on the Republic. And it was futile now to point fingers. Many good Romans were lost, both among the victors and the defeated. For the survivors here present, Cicero's speech brings forth the pain of their common sufferings to help them all let go. And Cicero takes up another point, relevant to the matter at hand, so eerie in its clairvoyance. For even now, there has been talk in Rome of plots against Caesar's life. But Caesar's dismissed them with philosophical indifference, saying, "I have lived long enough, either for nature or for glory." Cicero points this out and chides him for it, and he observes that so much more is at stake in Caesar's life than his own glory now. The fate of the Republic depends on it. Cicero tells Caesar, "Speak not to us then, I beg, of the wisdom of philosophers who make light of death. Let it not be at our peril that you play the sage." That's flattering, yes, but is he not speaking the plain truth? I mean, imagine the chaos, the horrors, the renewed wars that might follow if Caesar were to be assassinated. He must survive to carry on his work of reconciliation, which he can make great progress toward by sparing so conspicuous a former rival as Marcellus. And so Caesar does this very thing, and he pardons Marcellus before the eyes of all the senators in that very meeting. In so doing, he not only upholds his policy of clemency, but, so crucial, he does so in a way that honors the authority of the Senate, who in that same meeting rallied almost unanimously behind Cicero to urge the dictator toward clemency. Shortly thereafter, Cicero took up the cause for the pardon of another man, this time one who fought against Caesar in the Optimate resurgence in Africa that just ended. It was a guy that Caesar disliked intensely, and he really wanted to leave the guy in permanent exile. But Caesar commented to his friends, "Quintus Ligarius is finished in Rome. His case is closed, he's a villain, but what prevents us from enjoying the rare pleasure of a speech from Cicero?" And so Cicero steps forward and delivers another speech that also still exists today. But despite Caesar's reluctance, as Cicero is speaking and building up momentum, the case starts to seem less closed after all. Yes, Ligarius had ended up on the wrong side of the civil war. He fought against Caesar in Africa. But once again, it was hard for good men to decide. It was a common tragedy, a calamity brought on them by the gods. And Plutarch records, Caesar's face kept changing color during the speech, and it was manifest that all the emotions of his soul were stirred. And at last, when the great orator touched upon the struggles at Pharsalus, Caesar was so greatly affected that his body shook, and he dropped some of his documents from his hand. Cicero was pleading for a man who faced difficult choices, like he himself had. In this case, there was a prosecutor trying to persuade Caesar against pardoning, but Cicero points out that the prosecutor, too, had fought against Caesar at Pharsalus and obtained pardon. What seems to have moved Caesar, most of all, made him change color, as Plutarch suggests, and shake, was not just the tragedy of Pharsalus. It was that he could see standing before his eyes all the difficult choices his own sad war had forced upon the Romans. And he could see Cicero himself trying to do the right thing, trying to do what Caesar needed to be done, what all good Romans needed to do now, to put away their quarrels and learn to live together again. And so once again, Caesar took pity on all of them. Ligarius is pardoned. And Caesar is often blamed for being too nice with his enemies, considering what we all know happened later. But we need to think ourselves into Caesar's position at this time, not just the pressure he's under, the political necessity and so forth, but his genuine magnanimous care for the health of the state, not just a part of it, but the whole. And I think Cicero wasn't just saying that. I think it was all true. But indeed, incredible to say it, this very Ligarius went on to be one of the men who raised his bloody dagger on the Ides of March. Now you can imagine Caesar's been planning for a long time what he's got to do to solve all the problems once he gets back. First of all, there's the issue of rewarding his veterans. He starts by making big cash prizes to all of them, and regular men get, over and above all the pay that's due to them, bonuses totaling more than they would have made over the entire course of a full 16-year term of service in the army. And there are bigger bonuses for centurions and tribunes and high officers. So this is enough for a man to make some solid investments in a business, maybe a respectable one, maybe not. Or he could take the money and just have a really, really good time for a month or two. But Caesar knows many of his men have this kind of weakness and, they'd prefer to be respectable. And so he provides land for them to retire on and to live that ideal Roman country gent life. And many of these guys he sends out to new colonies that he's established in the western provinces, in Africa, in Spain, and Gaul. And Caesar's also got a heart for the Roman poor, always has. So every citizen gets a plum windfall of money, grain, and olive oil. And with so many idle hands living off the dole, he packs off huge droves of the indigent Roman civilians to his overseas colony establishment scheme. And the number of citizens who got sent out, the poor, they eventually reached some 80,000 people, citizens. They're taking their families too. And they'd leave their rickety urban tenements and join these veterans of Caesar's to go spread the new Roman peace and Roman values all across the Mediterranean. Again, especially in the less civilized western parts. And about the idle hands issue and the dole, this program of free grain that Clodius the Handsome set up in the mid-50s, well, it's now been shoveling out free wheat to some 320,000 families. State spending is out of control. So Caesar implements the kind of cutback a normal politician, worried about re-election and short-term public favor, just can't do. He conducts a new census of the Roman citizens, and on its basis, he reduces the number of urban grain recipients down from 320,000 families to 150,000, so less than half. And special priority is given to fathers of large families, who are Rome's citizen makers after all, and they're soldier makers. Then there was, of course, the calendar problem. The Roman calendar, like many ancient calendars, worked on the lunar schedule, and then they have this intercalary month to true up to the solar calendar every year. But it hasn't happened in recent years because of the chaos. It's like 3 months behind now. Just madness. So Caesar, in his capacity as Pontifex Maximus, he decides to solve the problem once and for all. And he's conversant in the latest scientific solutions, especially after his stay in Alexandria. And he appoints an expert philosopher to devise a solar calendar for Rome that, won't need these intercalary months, and he implements it. And this new Julian calendar became roughly the one that we use today, leap year and all. It was tightened just a little in the 16th century by Pope Gregory XIII, becoming the Gregorian calendar, I guess. But we still have Caesar's name on our calendar with the month of July, which is named after the Julian family. And that's an honor that the Senate voted him shortly after the calendar was implemented. And this doesn't show Caesar only in his mastery of all the administrative details of the state, but also, what better way to mark the beginning of a new era for Rome, with Caesar orchestrating the structure of time itself. And the city deserves a makeover too. His new additional forum, the Forum Julium, in addition to the other one that's also still there. This forum, he started in 54. It's finally ready now in 46, and he personally chairs the dedication ceremony. And he also builds a new temple as its centerpiece, the temple of Venus Genetrix, Venus the mother of the Julian clan through the hero Aeneas, and the mother of the Roman people. Now, Julius Caesar is already getting a little flack for trying to set himself up as a tyrant or a king. Actors are making pointed allusions in their plays and so on, the usual low-life grandstanders with nothing to lose. And Caesar dismisses these with amused benevolence. What threat were they? Of course, there are always going to be people that say this sort of thing when a man rises to rare heights in a republic, especially if he shakes things up a little. And anyway, how could anyone say that Caesar's lordly oversight of Rome wasn't beneficial? The Senate votes him the powers of censor, everything but the title. And so he issues a decree, among others, banning excessive and exotic expenditures. Purple robes and pearls are not to be worn in public, except on specified occasions. Gaudy funerals get hit with forced budget cuts. His soldiers burst into decadent households, trying to host illegal, clandestine luxury feasts. They confiscate bowls of squid ink pasta, or its ancient equivalent, right from beneath the drooping mandibles of effete partygoers. Old Roman morals for a new Roman future. And Caesar also grants citizenship. As censor, you can do this to resident medical doctors and teachers of the liberal arts. The citizenry needs a sound mind and a sound body. Mens sana in corpore sano. It's a new era. And the ranks of the Senate have slimmed down considerably too over the past few years. Let's not rehearse the unpleasant reasons why. Sulla, after his own civil war, increased the Senate's headcount from 300 to 600, and he filled it with his own loyalists. And Caesar starts filling the vacancies in much the same way. Again, in his capacity as censor, he can do this. I guess he could do it as dictator too, but anyway, that's what he does. But also, Caesar increases the Senate's total tally such that by his death it numbered 900 men. And many of these were good, respectable citizens from Italy. But yes, there were a few citizens from the provinces as well, North Africa, Spain, Gaul, some of them of a particularly new mint. There were complaints of wild, long-haired Gallic nobles exchanging their barbarian trousers for the toga, new senators wandering through the streets hoping someone would kindly tell them where exactly the Senate House was where they were supposed to be appearing for duty. And to the complainers, grousing about the debasement of the Senate, Caesar is said to have responded, "If bandits and cutthroats had helped me to defend my honor, I would have shown even them the gratitude they deserved." But, these guys are generally decent men. And of course, Caesar has standards. Excluded now and forever from the Senate were town criers, inviters to funerals, grave diggers, fencing masters, pimps, and, of course, goes without saying, actors. Now, as we've suggested, while he's implementing his various reforms, even though he's a dictator and he doesn't have to do this, Caesar does his best, wherever possible, to pass his policies in recognizable constitutional forms. The calendar reform, that's easy. He was pontifex. They have purview over that. Other decrees he passes through the Senate for approval. Though let's be honest, nobody wants to vote against Caesar now. And then he sends them on, these decrees, to the popular assembly to be ratified, where again, who wants to vote against Caesar? But often, with so many urgent matters needing attention, policies get occasionally, let's say, expedited. Caesar and his advisors make decisions behind closed doors, and they just issue a decree in the name of the Senate, listing names in favor and all, without the Senate ever even seeing it. Sure, it was unilateral, but the Senate would have voted in favor of it anyway, right? And at least they were doing the Senate the dignity of using its name as the officially certifying body of Rome, right? But on occasions, Cicero is surprised to receive letters from rulers or communities in the provinces thanking him for voting in favor of their petitions, when this was the first occasion he's so much as heard of the resolution, and even the first time he's ever encountered the names of the people that he's supposedly benefited. But even if you're a diehard Republican and you are shocked by the lack of due process, you have to hand it to Caesar. He was efficient. Caesar knows that fortune is fickle, and he's got a stronger mandate now than he ever may have, again, to make reforms. And it's best to be quick with these things when you've got momentum. And indeed, nobody found anything to reproach in his policies when it came to administration and solving real problems. He was just, wise, and creative. And if you think of things from his perspective for a moment, he's been building up and running a huge military, legislative, administrative, propagandistic apparatus for nearly 15 years, answerable to him only, without reference to Republican norms and procedures. On multiple continents at the same time he's been running this machine, and experience showed his way worked much, much better when it came to pure getting things done. There were lingering provincial disputes to handle, taxes to levy, taxes to remit, lands to buy and sell, border security issues. And what was the Roman state, after all? Was it a city? Or was it the greatest empire the world had ever seen? For too long, Rome has been run like a city, with provincial proconsuls sauntering out into far-flung governors' mansions, doing a little admin, doing a little business, and then sauntering back into Rome after a year or two, big cash on hand, to launch their next scheme in the game of city prestige. The grand families passed on their vast provincial patronage networks like private family estates. How was this system really serving the whole, the tens of millions which looked to Rome for justice, for stability through strength? And this was the real political point of Caesar's Senate packing. It was a deliberate move to decrease the portion of Roman urban society members in the Senate and to weight it in favor of outsiders. Rome was not just a city-state. It was a vast empire, and the Senate, too, needed to come to terms with that practical reality. But consider also Rome's citizen ranks. After the social war of Caesar's teenage days, they now count all the free native men of Italy, to say nothing of the individual citizens and citizen communities spread across the empire. These were now all formally the populace, the P in SPQR. Could the mandatorily in-person citizen voting assemblies of the city of Rome, which for sheer practicality could only ever poll an actual electorate, perhaps in the tens of thousands, could these really make any claim to being anything more than a symbolic rehearsal of the revered voice of the people? Caesar is very aware of the importance of symbols, but on the level of government, you could ask a similar question to this of practically all the hallowed customs of the Roman constitution. What end did they all serve? Did they all make sense? Did they all deserve equal respect? It's not surprising that a creative, practical mind like Caesar's, the mind which had personally visited every province in Rome's domain, might think outside the box a little when it came to solving the problems of empire. Again, Caesar's trying to be gentle with his new vision, to just be the first citizen. He doesn't want to spook anybody. But for all his best efforts here, he's also got the very real, very new problem for a Roman in Rome of being an unprecedented target for flattery and adulation, because it's obvious to everyone that all power now effectively flows from him. Immediately upon his return, the Senate started voting him all sorts of extravagant honors. He did accept a few, a permanent seat in the curule chair in the Senate, right next to the consuls, for life, that he should always state his opinion first in the Senate, that he should always give the signal at all the games and the circus and so on. Most of the honors he rejected, though. But this honoring and performative fawning upon him, they put him in a difficult spot, because if he rejects the honors of the Senate too forcefully, he insults their judgment and their authority to convey honors, and this perceived arrogance would provoke envy. But if he accepts too many of them, he'll also provoke envy, because he'd be welcoming the perception that he deserved more than any Roman, which would also be arrogant, wouldn't it? And surely Caesar suspected this as well, that this was precisely the pickle that many of Caesar's secret enemies were hoping to squeeze him into. That is, by their very praise, to put him in disfavor. To stabilize Rome on a new footing, it was going to take not just an incredible capacity for work and social and political finesse, but a lot of time for people to adjust. So imagine how frustrating it was for Caesar to realize that he had yet another war to fight, especially since it was in a place where he had already won a great campaign in the Civil War only a few years earlier: Spain. The hardest thing to do for most leaders, especially when they find themselves at the head of a huge enterprise, is to find competent people that they can trust to do a good job in their absence. After his first victory in Spain, Caesar entrusted the governorship to a man who ended up being weak and unfit. Weak in the sense that he gave in to his greed and plundered the province. He held back pay from the soldiers because he was skimming it, and then he responded to any challenges to his decisions or authority with harshness and rage, probably motivated by fear and guilt. It was also small-minded and unambitious, really. Caesar was a pretty good judge of character, but it's not always easy to see who is going to come apart at the seams when you entrust them with great power. And the man in question quickly became hated by the provincials, but also, especially fatal, by the soldiers as well. And he survived an assassination attempt, and then he tried to flee the province, but he ended up drowning in a shipwreck while running away. So there's no governor, and into this void rushed the last hot dregs of the Pompeian resistance. In particular, it was the two sons of Pompey, Gnaeus and Sextus, and they were soon joined by Caesar's old lieutenant, Labienus, fresh from his defeat in Africa. And the rebels go around Spain proclaiming liberation, making big promises, and they get a large section of southern Spain to turn to their cause. And a couple of legions formerly loyal to Caesar were so angry at their handling by that ex-governor that they even fall in with the Pompeians too. At first, Caesar tries to entrust the war effort to lieutenants, but he quickly realizes things are getting out of hand. And now Caesar's got to make a decision. He's got a ton of work to do in Rome. He's 54 years old and slowing down a little. His campaigns are hard on your health, even putting aside the risk of dying in battle. And he also said around this time, it gives you goosebumps a little, that it was more important for the Republic to go on living than he himself, since he already had ample glory and power, and if anything happened to him, the state would relapse into civil war of a much worse kind. So why not just try another lieutenant, somebody a little bit more senior maybe? Why risk it all? The sons of Pompey have now raised a stunning 13 legions against Caesar in Spain. And while Gnaeus Pompey, the elder of the brothers, is not the soldier that his father was, he is determined and violent. And this is the man who almost murdered Cicero for wanting to throw in the towel after the Battle of Pharsalus. And even Cassius, later one of the chief conspirators against Caesar, is writing to Cicero around this time. He says, quote, "I am very concerned about what is happening in Spain. I would rather stick with the old gentle master," meaning Caesar, "than have a new and cruel one. You know how stupid Gnaeus is. You know how he mistakes cruelty for courage, and how he thinks we always mock him. I am afraid he will repay our wit with the sword, peasant style." End quote. So even these former optimates who've made peace with Caesar are worried that their heads might end up on pikes if the sons of Pompey somehow unroll the civil war once again. So Caesar decides one last time to take the risk and bet on himself and put this rebellion down personally before it gets bigger. And so to the great anxiety of everyone in Rome, he sets out in late November, 46 BC, after only a few months in the city. Caesar arrives with blitzing speed. He meets the armies of Pompey's sons only 27 days after leaving Rome. And even at this breakneck pace, he gets bored along the way, and he writes a lengthy poem called The Journey, Iter, which sadly hasn't survived. But so he gets there, and the campaign takes place around the Guadalquivir Valley, which is in the south of Spain, and Caesar starts by laying siege to Cordoba, the capital of that province, to draw the enemy forces off from another siege that they're doing, one of the few towns in the area that's remained loyal to Caesar. And this forces the Pompeians to split their army, which is important because Caesar, he's pretty strong on cavalry in this campaign, but he's far outmatched in infantry. He's only got 8 legions fighting with him, and only 2 of them are veteran. The rest are new recruits. So he's got 10 versus their 13. And still the Pompeians keep avoiding battle, though, harassing him, trying to wear him down over the winter, and this campaign starts to drag on. The local communities and enemy soldiers, though, they start defecting to Caesar. True to his character, Gnaeus Pompey cracks down on the dissenters with extreme cruelty. At one point, Caesar is sieging a town, and he gets secret word that the town's leaders want to defect. But no sooner does he hear this than he sees the Pompeian garrison commander march dozens of leading citizens suspected of disloyalty with their wives and children to the top of the walls for all Caesar's forces to see, and he slaughters them all and dumps their bodies onto the ground. It's a cruel, grinding slog like this. But time is working in Caesar's favor, as usual, because as the Pompeians keep avoiding battle, the locals get more and more skeptical about their ability to defeat Julius Caesar, and the defections start to increase. And at last, Caesar camps in the neighborhood of a city called Munda, and one morning, Gnaeus Pompey musters up and lays out his army for battle on a ridge. And Caesar marches out too. He gets to the base of the ridge, and then he waits a while. Gnaeus has a much stronger position. Caesar's infantry, and especially his cavalry, they're going to be very hampered fighting uphill. But Caesar decides, after a while, to roll the dice, because who knows if he'll get another chance. And he sounds the attack. Two huge lines, more than 30,000 on either side, lock into the struggle. For a while, it seems like Pompey's getting the best of the fight. Caesar's line starts to falter in one spot. And as he's done so many times before, he dashes out past his surprised officers, rushes in personally to the weak spot, catching arrows with his shield. Then he gets within 10 paces of the killing zone where the lines meet. He shouts, he calls names, he forms his men up to renew the fight. Then his centurions and officers finally catch up with him, and this little knot tightens the lines long enough for the trusty 10th to break through and punch a hole in the enemy formation on the other side of the battle. Gnaeus Pompey orders Labienus to take a reserve legion in and plug the gap. But it's too late. Caesar's cavalry, horses panting, are already encircling the flank on that side. And then they begin the bloody roll-up. And Titus Labienus falls in battle. And together with him, a reported 30,000 Pompeian soldiers. And the Optimate cause, if you can really even call it that at this point, finally melts away in terror. Caesar himself at the Battle of Munda loses 1,000 men, which is a lot for a victorious army. It's way more than he lost at Pharsalus. And then after the battle, he said, "I have striven many times for victory, but now for the first time I strove for my life." Titus Labienus, his bitter old comrade, he gives a proper Roman burial. Gnaeus Pompey escapes the battle wounded, but he's hunted down, and eventually his head is brought to Caesar. Sextus Pompey, the younger, manages to get away, and he soon goes on to make big problems for Caesar's successors. But that's later, a story Caesar won't live to see. For now, Caesar can declare it is finally finished. Then shortly after the battle, a young visitor arrives in his camp. A 17-year-old of uncommonly good looks, but modest height and slight build. It's his nephew, Gaius Octavius. Caesar may have had his doubts about the man that would eventually be Rome's first emperor. True, he's shown some promise. Octavius, when he was only 12 years old, the boy gave the funeral oration in the Forum for Caesar's sister, who's Octavius's grandmother. I mean, that is kind of precociously young for a public appearance of that sort. And Caesar is doing his part to let the kid get opportunities. When Domitius Bronzebeard Ahenobarbus fell in battle at Pharsalus, he left a slot open in the College of Pontiffs, and Caesar arranged for Octavius to fill it. And he also arranged for young Octavius to ride in his chariot during the African triumph. The kid's already got Caesar's ear on a couple of occasions, interceding for clemency for certain friends. However, when Octavius was entrusted with ceremonial duties around the triumphal festivities, he apparently got sunstroke and he was bedridden for many days. So, good work ethic, weak constitution. And just here, Caesar invited Octavius to join him on the Spanish campaign, but the kid had to stay home sick for several months, and he's finally arriving now, just now, after the decisive battle, only after being shipwrecked, mind you, on the way over. Does this boy have the stamina, and does he have the luck that it takes to be the first man in Rome? This kind of question is now more urgent for Caesar. That is the question of succession. Because it's become pretty clear to him that the Republic cannot go back to the old way things were done in the foreseeable future, if it ever could. Power now rests not in the hands of the Senate, but with whoever controls the armies. Now, for a Roman magnate to think about succession, not in terms of his family legacy, but in terms of, well, some other kind of dynasty, I guess. The idea of passing on not your estate, but the leadership of the state. Well, this has been unthinkable since the expulsion of the kings 450 years ago. But it's now a major problem on Caesar's mind. And so to address it, Caesar brings Octavius into his officer's tent, and he has the kid share with him in meals, councils, private discussions with officers, secretaries, everything. The two of them spend a month or so in Spain, just like this. Now, the later sources, like Nicolaus of Damascus, who was the later future emperor's secretary and his first biographer, they describe this situation here in Spain as though Caesar is grooming Octavius to succeed him, tutoring him, if you will. Maybe that's partly true, but I think it's mostly propaganda. Here's what I think is going on. Caesar pretty confidently knows the mettle of the other men around him, Mark Antony, Decimus Brutus, Lepidus, the guy he left in charge in Rome in his absence. He knows Cicero, Trebonius, Hirtius, Appius, hundreds of other men capable enough to at least be useful in whatever was coming. But with Octavius, Caesar's only had a couple of real interactions here and there at Rome. And that's all while he's been very busy juggling other things. Now, though, he has a little bit more leisure. And so here in Spain, he's not grooming Octavius. Rather, Caesar is exposing Octavius to the full fury of his scrutiny, his world-altering attention, his singular Grand Master's analysis of the possibilities latent in any situation or person. And to the extent Caesar taught him anything, it was in order to see how well Octavius was capable of learning, of rising to the task that only Caesar himself could appreciate the enormity of. And this was one of the greatest tests of the future Emperor Augustus's life. And so it seems he passed. But while that was reassuring to Caesar the statesman, I think it can't have been very comforting to Caesar the man. Because there is a little boy at home waiting for him, old enough to call him father, to look up to him, to brighten when he enters the room, to run to him and reach out to be picked up, and old enough to ask his mother, the Egyptian queen, "Where's my dad?" Surely Caesar has plenty of time to figure all of this out, this succession issue. He's 55 years old. Yes, maybe slowing down a little bit, but in good health. It's not like he has to decide everything right now. But Julius Caesar is not the sort of man who can deceive himself out of recognizing the hard fact. If anyone could possibly be his successor, there was only going to be one pair of boots to fill. War is so clarifying. Even if you have to make tough choices, at least you have an enemy. You have objectives, you put aside secondary cares, and you do what it takes to get the victory. But now we have to think about what Caesar is returning to. For one thing, since the end of the war in Africa, elections at Rome have resumed in some form. However, in reality, Caesar picks all the magistrates. And the mechanism is not so clear to us now, but Basically, he designates his preferred candidates for consuls, praetors, aedile, quaestor, etc. And somehow, what do you know? His guys all get elected. He's also choosing the provincial governor assignments, military staffing, everything. Well, consider what this means. The challenge of selecting men, of promoting men, of entrusting duties to them, seeing that they get appropriate honors. In other words, the job of channeling all ambitions and rivalries, orchestrating all the violent tensions of mimetic desire into a productive orchestra. Well, in the past, the established Republican system used to handle all of that. If you lost your election, blame the fickle crowd, blame the bribery, blame yourself. You could even blame the system if you want, but what good would that do you? But now, the responsibility to balance all of these forces is all falling on Caesar. And now it actually makes sense to blame the system because it's just one man, and you could do something about one man. It's not surprising that they say his alleged epileptic fits started flaring up again around this time. He's supposed to have had an episode during the Spanish campaign. Then maybe he was an epileptic. But what if they were just panic attacks, the product of all the exhaustion, the incredible stress of all the weight that he's carrying? I once had a panic attack many years ago. I had no idea what happened. I didn't even think I was stressed. I thought it was some weird neurological thing. So who knows? But Caesar is surrounded by very ambitious, very talented, very dangerous men counting on him to recognize how much more excellent they are than all the other contenders. On his way back to Italy, overland, summer of 45 BC now, he meets up with Mark Antony. Caesar and Antony had a bit of a falling out over Antony mismanaging the city while Caesar was away in Egypt. But here's a soldier who served him well, a distant cousin actually, from a good family of course. Antony fought with Caesar in Gaul. He fought for his interest in Rome as tribune right before the Civil War started. He played a big role early in the Greece campaign against Pompey. Caesar and Antony, they make up. And Caesar promises him the consulship for the upcoming year of 44. And then Decimus Brutus meets Caesar in Gaul too. This is the less famous Brutus, not the main character in Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar. Shakespeare calls this particular man Decius Brutus because the translation he was using had an error in it. Well, Decimus Brutus, he's been a top lieutenant in Caesar's army for a long time from the early days. He was the commander of the fleet against the Veneti in Brittany back in 56. He played a key role against Vercingetorix, the Battle of Alesia. He led the fleet again at the Siege of Marseille in the Civil War. He's been governing here in southern Gaul basically since that victory in the Civil War. Decimus is very clever, ancient noble family. He learned the Celtic language. He is possibly the most skilled of all Caesar's subordinate commanders in military affairs. But Decimus is wondering, is he Caesar's top guy? Maybe he's getting the sense that the answer is no. Still, Caesar designates him for consul for the year 42 and governor of Cisalpine Gaul for the upcoming year of 44. And that is a very cushy job where he can enjoy the massive riches that he's won under Caesar. It's a serious job too. But how could a man like Antony or Decimus, a Roman bred like these men were, who certainly admired Caesar, still, how could such a man not wonder if someday he might be the first man in Rome? And as Caesar rides back in his private carriage to Rome with these men, it might have occurred to him, Brutus and Decimus are loyal, but do they have the imagination and clarity to realize how things have changed? Are they believers? Now, the Spanish War was, in a way, a war against infidels, people who doubted the fact, questioned the finality of what Caesar accomplished. Not that Labienus and the sons of Pompey were men of stirring ideals, but there still are men out there captivated by the Republican fantasy that the Optimates took up as their banner in war. Another man rising in Caesar's new regime is the other Brutus, Marcus Junius Brutus. You may recall Caesar's longtime love affair with Servilia, Cato's half-sister. Well, that is Brutus's mom. And you may recall how Caesar spared Brutus after he fought on the Optimate side at Pharsalus. I mean, he even told his soldiers, so the story goes, look for Brutus and make sure you don't kill him in the battle. Well, as Caesar was setting out for his last visit to Spain, This Brutus published a little book in praise of Cato, consolidating Cato's status as a hero and martyr of the lost cause of the Optimates. Brutus fancied himself a philosopher after all, and Cato was his uncle. But the fact that Brutus felt safe enough in publishing this book in praise of Caesar's nemesis, it's a testimony to Caesar's magnanimous clemency toward his former adversaries. And when Cicero politely suggested to Brutus that he'd done a bit of a shabby job, Brutus encouraged Cicero to write his own, and Cicero did, and that was published too. So you've got these two books in praise of Cato circulating. Now, your average despot might look at a posthumous praise of his worst enemy as an act of sedition. But Caesar, with his true Roman lightness, reads both books in a spirit of friendly banter, and he lets it be known to Cicero that he enjoyed both praises of Cato immensely. But while Brutus's book made Caesar feel like Caesar himself was actually a better writer than he thought, Cicero's book made Caesar realize that he had much to learn about good style. See that? Caesar's always learning. What a guy. Well, to be fair, Caesar's mood about the books was probably eased after his victory in Spain, which is when he actually read those books. But still, his implicit message to Cicero and all of the wistful lovers of the old Republican ways is, hey, write what you like. It's no big deal. You live in a free state. Speak your mind. This is Rome, after all. Still, Caesar can't let them have the last word entirely, and he writes his own response in his book, Anti-Cato. It's lost, sadly, but what a great name for a book against your enemy. Just Anti-Cato. And what we know about it suggests that it was a withering vituperation of Cato as a niggardly penny pincher, a pompous faker, a greedy partisan striver. The man had his half-brother Caepio cremated in fine clothes and fine jewelry, but afterwards ran the ashes through a sieve to collect the melted-down gold. Need we go on? But that was the Roman style in public clashes. You make these lurid accusations, maybe some of them you kind of make up. And Cicero said worse things about some of his own political enemies in front of the Senate and the Roman people, and many of these rhetorical victims of his are still around, and he gets on okay with them. It's a republic. And after the wicked burn on Cato, Caesar considers the whole incident water under the bridge, and he just keeps on his jolly way with Brutus and Cicero. And Cicero even wrote back to Caesar to tell him that he enjoyed the Anti-Cato. You kind of have to, I guess. But it seems to me that the higher Caesar rose, the more firm became his commitment not to rule as a tyrant, or at least to signal accordingly. This latter Brutus, Junius Brutus, the philosopher, he also meets Caesar in Gaul on Caesar's way back to Rome, and he came away from the interaction convinced that Caesar was going over to the good men, in his words, and that in his vocabulary meant that he was embracing the Optimate spirit and doing his best to restore the Republic. Think about it. Caesar, turning toward the Optimates. This was surely naive, at least as Cicero thought, and probably influenced by Caesar's promises to Brutus to make him praetor for the upcoming year and consul in 41, as soon as he was eligible by age. But it's impossible to discount the impression that Caesar ultimately did not want to rule over loyal subjects. He wanted most of all to enjoy the willing esteem of free men, free Romans. And to do that, he knew he couldn't force them. He had to convince them, to win them over, if he could. But he knows he's not going to win over everyone. Caesar finally re-enters Rome for his triumph in October of 45. Theoretically, there was still the fig leaf that this was a victory over foreign enemies, because the sons of Pompey recruited loads of Africans and Spaniards into their armies. But yes, it was a thin pretense for the final bloody act of civil war that made Caesar the unquestioned master of the entire Mediterranean basin. And in the parade, one single man, a tribune of the plebs, Pontius Aquila, refuses to stand from his bench as Caesar passes by. Caesar, of course, notices. He's annoyed. And he calls out to the man, "All right then, Aquila, you're a tribune. Why don't you sue me? Take back the Republic." And for days after that, every time he makes a promise or a resolution, he adds, "That is, if it's okay with Pontius Aquila. It's kind of a hick-sounding name, too, so you can imagine the effect. So a bit of discontent was understandable and certainly tolerable. Caesar is confident that the Roman political classes, they realize the choice before them. They can either adjust to a somewhat novel state of affairs in politics or take the alternative, a new bloody civil war with much less scrupulous men likely to wind up on top. As Napoleon later observed, it was the person of Caesar that guaranteed the supremacy of Rome over the universe. Caesar is the cornerstone now, holding up the arch and keeping it from collapsing. In time, he's confident, they will come to see the current state of affairs as the best possible outcome. But how could he know then that he only had 6 months left? Julius Caesar wants to use his new mandate to usher in a new era of glory for Rome. In Alexandria, the great library of the Ptolemies captivated his imagination before he accidentally burned it down. And he orders a similar institution created at Rome and puts in charge of it the great scholar Marcus Terentius Varro, who fought with Pompey in Spain in the Civil War, as we mentioned in an earlier episode, but now Caesar's got him on his team, running this library. What a guy. But this is only the start. Currently, major shipments to the city generally have to go through Puteoli on the Bay of Naples, and then they make this long trek over land because the mouth of the Tiber, there's a port there, Ostia, but it's always silted up. I mean, you can't get major ships in there. So Caesar plans to dredge the harbor at Ostia, sink giant moles, and make it permanently accessible to the largest ships. And he also plans to reroute the Tiber so as to cut back on the flooding in the city of Rome. Not only that, to the southeast of the city, there's a great tract of uninhabitable flat land called the Pomptine Marshes, and Caesar plans to drain them all, create thousands of acres of new land for cultivation. He even wants to drain the Fucine Lake, which is this huge body of water in central Italy, for the same purpose. And he even proposes cutting a canal at the Isthmus of Corinth. I mean, think of all the good Roman jobs for good Roman citizens this would create. None of those plans worked out for Caesar. You can guess the reason. The Pomptine Marshes weren't drained until the early 20th century. The Fucine Lake was drained in 1878, and the Corinth Canal was finally cut in 1893. These are the kind of projects you can only do with an incredible willpower, with huge centralized resources and a gigantic mandate, especially before the Industrial Revolution. But I think Caesar would have done it all if he had more time. He had all of those necessary things. He had that mandate, or so he felt. What mandate are we talking about exactly? Well, Caesar controls all the armed forces, both those mobilized and those decommissioned, through a combination of personal loyalty to himself as their benefactor and the victor in the Civil War, and legally as dictator and consul, which are offices voted to him by the Senate and the people of Rome. And that grants him, among other things, the right to choose and appoint proconsular commanders as his effective subordinates. And now, the Senate also votes him the office of censor for life, the rights of the tribune of the plebs, and various other authorities. In sum, it all amounts to the constitutional right to do basically anything he sees fit in war, law, public works, morality. Each individual aspect of his authority is intelligible in a thoroughly Roman republican way. But the combination of all these powers in one man, it was very hard to call that Roman and republican. And this brings us to the age-old question, which clearly vexed Romans in these final days, as it has vexed Caesar observers ever since. Did Julius Caesar want to be a king, intend to become a king? The name here is important on several grounds. To be the first man in Rome, to such an extreme degree that you are basically a monarch, as Sulla maybe was briefly, as Pompey almost was, well, that doesn't necessarily end the republic, because you'll die, and things can revert to a more normal state of affairs again. But to be a king implies that you're in a permanent monarchy and your successor will be a king. And that's a very different proposition. The Romans were once ruled by kings, and then they drove them out in 504 BC. Napoleon makes a very good point at the end of his commentaries on Caesar's Gallic Wars. And it's worth considering his opinion because Napoleon was a man who resembled Julius Caesar maybe more than anyone has ever since Caesar's lifetime, and Napoleon knew it. Caesar did not wish to be a king, he says. The anecdotes that Caesar's accusers cite are all from sources that come significantly after Caesar's life. But Napoleon objects, quote, if Caesar had perceived some advantage to his authority from sitting on a throne, he would have achieved this through the acclamations of the army and the Senate prior to allowing the Pompeians to resume their seats there. He would not achieve such a goal by having himself proclaimed king by a drunkard during a procession. More on that incident later. He would have persuaded his legions that their glory and prosperity depended on a new form of government which would put his family out of reach of the toga-wearing factions, and he would have let it be said in the Senate that it was necessary to put the laws out of reach of the victorious soldiery and to protect private property from the greed of the veterans by raising a monarch onto the throne. But he followed a different course. Though conqueror, he only governed as consul, dictator, or tribune, and thus he reinforced the ancient forms of the Republic instead of discrediting them. End quote. And that seems close to the mark, at least on one level. Caesar knows that even if Rome having a single king were the best thing for the empire, because there is a certain transcendent power in a single individual charismatic monarch for unifying a vast, diverse set of peoples, as he's learned from his exploits in the barbarian lands, most especially in Egypt, that even if having a king were the best thing for Rome itself now, because it would be impossible for Rome to certify her power over her sprawling domains or to solve all her internal problems that were pressing, current and future, without a unified executive who stood above faction and personal interest, because his interest was by definition the health of the state. Even if that were the best, the Romans, these Romans of the Republic, would never accept a king. Rome would cease to be Rome. And how could Caesar disagree? He was a Republican too. And so he was trying to do something novel, frightful, for which there was no playbook. To preserve a Republican system, formally at least, through the use of that very monarchic principle, which was its antithesis. To say that he was trying to do this may be true, but it also oversimplifies the matter. Because while his churning mind could generate all sorts of scenarios for how exactly to go about it, plans A, B, and C, and D, ready for all sorts of contingencies, Caesar ultimately had to proceed one step at a time and adjust according to the changing circumstances. I mean, this is fundamentally an experiment in which the political possibilities can only be discovered through action. It was extremely risky, and he knew it. But to step away from engaging in this unprecedented work, to let the Republic slide back into its disordered, chaotic status quo, where the fate of the known world would be left open once again to the exploitation of the most cunning, short-sighted opportunists. This would not only be unambitious, it would be a failure of duty. Because the people of Rome, the 100,000 soldiers, millions of provincials, fate itself had entrusted him with this duty, and they were looking to Julius Caesar to save the state. Many aspects of the new order are going to be hard to swallow for principled Republicans. There's all these new guys in the recently expanded 900-seat Senate. Many of them are hard to call Romans at all. But the whole city, from the high to the low places, is filling with outsiders. Cicero complains to a friend that Rome is getting less funny. Quote, "Whatever you might say about it, I have a weakness for humor, our native brand most of all, especially in view of its present decline. For adulterated as humor already became in Latium after the influx of foreigners into our city, now with the accession of the trousered tribes from all over the Alps, it has become so overwhelmed that no trace of that happy old wit is anymore to be found." End quote. That's kind of hard to imagine, right? A culture getting less funny. Weird. Well, Caesar himself is aware of this problem, surely. The native Latin salt, as they call it, losing its flavor. In his youth, Caesar compiled a handbook of witticisms. Even now, he mentioned how he has some of his top guys in the informal Ministry of Letters visiting Cicero regularly to study rhetoric and philosophy, and they report back all of Cicero's best latest jokes. And perhaps they report more than that. Cicero could be more caustic and gloomy when he let his guard down. He sometimes referred to Caesar sarcastically these days as the king in his letters. And once he joked to a friend, "The only way Caesar can restore the Republic is by hanging himself." And Cicero's cranky nephew Quintus is a firm Caesar supporter, and he's in the middle of a major falling out with his uncle. And Quintus is now blabbing at parties about how my uncle Cicero hates Caesar. This was potentially concerning because Cicero is a bellwether of opinion among the old guard, and Caesar does need their support. But Caesar doesn't seem like he was all that worried. He preferred to let men talk freely in private, because that's what you do in a republic. And even Cicero was pretty sure that no one would mistake him for a dangerous man anymore. Cicero even records an instance where the dictator stopped by his villa in the Bay of Naples around this time. It's a long custom of key Roman dignitaries to spend plenty of time outside the city at their villas, and Caesar is often making the circuits, visiting them for meetings. The imperator comes with his whole entourage, the moving center of Roman power, all of his key staff and 2,000 soldiers. Friedrich Gundolf, in his book Mantle of Caesar, observes insightfully that Caesar, despite his clear superiority, he sought encounters with Cicero only where he could put himself in the position of showing gratitude, homage, almost entreaty. Well, Cicero tells his friend Atticus, in a letter about the encounter, "Strange that so onerous a guest should leave a memory not disagreeable. It was really very pleasant." And Cicero gives some interesting details. So the soldiers pitch their tents out on the ground of Cicero's villa. Caesar takes a walk along the shore. I like to imagine that's where he does some of his most important work, on walks like that. He takes a bath, he gets an olive oil rub down, and then he joins Cicero for dinner. The dictator eats and drinks with uninhibited gusto, which is uncharacteristic of Caesar, feasting heavily. But Cicero notes here that the dictator was currently on a regimen of the art of emetics, which means that he'd be emptying out the contents of his stomach before heading to bed. This was very fashionable around the time. And they talk, just talk, about the good things that long interested them. No politics, nothing weighty. Perhaps they spoke of the beloved daughters that they both had lost. But most of the conversation, Cicero suggests, was over poets, philosophers, wit, style, and art. The sort of things that quietly made Rome not just a city of power, but a place worth living in. Memories that allow hardened old rivals to put away the troubles and remember that they are fellow men who share so many of the same peculiar local loves, as well as being fellow citizens of a republic that drew the world's most interesting knowledge and culture to herself and made it her own. But then, what Romans love most of all is honor. Consider a man like Decimus Brutus, Caesar's loyal lieutenant. This guy traced his family lineage, like the other Brutus, to the ancient Brutus, the one who drove out the kings of Rome. Decimus was the grandson and great-grandson of consuls. He was restoring his family's dignity after it waned under his dissolute father. But the men depicted in the wax masks at Decimus's family altar had all won their honor by the will of the Senate and the Roman people. Decimus is a praetor now, and he's slated to hold the consulship in a few years. But now there are not 8 praetors as before, but 16 after Caesar raised the number. Pure math suggests that the office carries half the prestige now, half the dignitas. But on top of that, the election itself is a meaningless formality. Decimus's honor comes at the sole will of Caesar. What does it even mean? What does such an honor prove about a man, except that he performed well for his boss? What actions could he undertake in war, legislation, public works, that wouldn't ultimately be chalked up to the man whose approval he would necessarily need, at least implicitly, to the man who, as it were, hired him? And even the consulship might seem like a small consolation prize. I mean, the notion of being slated for a consulship by a dictator as a reward for service. It smacked of being a permanent client, never a full, independent patron like his ancestors. And this was something that not even Sulla did. Even after he won the Civil War, he let elections go on unimpeded, more or less. But Caesar could point out, one of the very men Sulla allowed to be elected consul, against Sulla's own recommendation, launched a bloody failed revolution just after Sulla's death. And Sulla's regime, which was short-sighted to begin with and was weakened by his own subordinates within a few years of his passing, and then systematically unwound by Caesar himself, wasn't the lesson to take from it that no ambitious reformer could entrust the state to the old republican system of offices and honors again. But many of the key figures in Caesar's new order have a similar story to Decimus. Among Caesar's allies, for example, there's also Trebonius, who passed the law in 55 to extend Caesar's command in Gaul, the Lex Trebonia, and then fought under Caesar in that same great war. There was infighting, too, among his loyalists. Caesar wants to make young Dolabella consul for the year 44. He's promising, if erratic, but Mark Antony is vehemently opposed. They hate each other after this power struggle that they got into during Caesar's absence. On the side of Caesar's former enemies in the Civil War, the other Brutus, the philosopher, seems to be coming on fine with all the honors that Caesar's piled on him. Brutus's friend Cassius, too, seems like he's doing okay. Cassius is a very strong soldier. He did well in Syria after Crassus's disaster against the Parthians at Carrhae. Cassius saved 10,000 men. It was noteworthy that these men didn't join the side of the desperate Pompeian holdouts in Spain. Caesar designated Cassius praetor for the year 44 alongside Brutus. But then, rewarding former enemies causes resentment among the loyalists, including the soldiers. After all, those guys were responsible for the death of their comrades, and now they're being honored with leading roles. But Caesar's kind of locked in by the circumstances. He pardoned them when he thought the war was over, and then it flared up again, and they backed him up. It's very dangerous to leave proud men unrewarded, unhonored. And on top of that, both camps of aristocrats, his old guard and the repentant newcomers, will naturally be resentful of another group of Caesar's supporters, guys like Hirtius, Balbus, Oppius, who came from nowhere, who would have been nothing without Caesar, no family, but they now enjoyed huge influence, and they're effectively gatekeepers of personal access to Caesar. Granted, most of them hold no official republican magistracies, but that only highlighted the fact that the magistracies, like the consul and the praetor, just didn't matter as much anymore because the real power was with Caesar. It's not easy to find time with him either. In these last months, Cicero came to pay him a visit. Caesar is busy with maybe the greatest workload any Roman or maybe even any human has had up to that point, and Cicero is sitting there in a courtyard in Caesar's house, waiting to be summoned, waiting and waiting. Caesar knows this, and he remarks to one of his associates, "I must be a most unpopular man. There's Marcus Cicero himself sitting there, and he can't get in to see me at his own convenience. He is the most easygoing of mankind, but I don't doubt that he detests me." So if the genial Cicero is straining under the circumstances, having to wait his long turn to pay court to Caesar, what are other men feeling? As in Gaul and so many times before, Caesar has no illusions, and he acknowledges the moral seriousness of men frustrated now at the prospect, in effect, of being ruled. But Caesar is now locked into a game with different rules, and even he doesn't have the freedom to change all of them. There's no climbing down from this pinnacle. But he needs the nobles especially, including his former enemies, because, as Napoleon again observed, Rome now needed the magic attaching to men with names which had conquered, governed, and molded the destinies of Europe, Asia, and Africa over the course of centuries. In other words, beyond the talent, the patronage networks, the wealth of men such as Decimus, Trebonius, Dolabella, Cassius, Brutus. They have something perhaps even more valuable, especially now. In a great political transformation, as was clearly underway, the power of symbols is incalculable. And these men are living symbols of continuity, more vibrant and convincing to the turbulent masses and the anxious elites than any priesthood, temple, or title of office. And also, yes, more dangerous. These are daring spirits in the prime of their life, late 30s to around 40, men of blood and action. Caesar knows the risks full well. From the outside to the keen observer, politics now seemed so much simpler at Rome. It is what Caesar wills it to be. It looks simpler to everyone except the man who has personally taken all that enormous complexity onto his own back. But Caesar is working up a big plan to put some distance between him and the dizzying fray of competing interests, all the hopes and grudges and principled remonstrances. It was time for a new campaign. Caesar has had his eye on Parthia for a long time. Crassus marched to Parthia in 54 and died in the greatest military disaster for Rome of the entire era at Carrhae. See the Cost of Glory series that we did on the richest man in Rome. And at that battle, the Parthians captured the Roman army's sacred eagle standards. Crassus was Caesar's mentor and political godfather, so it was personal. And the collective Roman revenge was long due. But it would be a mistake to call this a vanity campaign. The Parthian Empire, again, it's based in Mesopotamia, more or less, but their domain stretches from the border of Roman Syria all the way east to Afghanistan. They are the successor of the Persian Empire. They're a Persian people themselves, the Parthians. And they are the only serious border threat left for Rome. It was only the expert generalship of young Cassius in the aftermath of Carrhae that drove the Parthians back from pushing on to conquer Syria, now a Roman province. Another troubling factor here that Caesar's thinking about, Roman Syria itself is now in open revolt. There's a renegade Pompeian commander there, bent on reviving the civil war. Sextus Pompey, the younger surviving brother, is still at large too. If those men could get the Parthians to support them in a war against the Roman regime, Mithridates style, it could cause serious trouble. Caesar is amassing 16 legions, that is 80,000 infantry, roughly, and 10,000 cavalry for a great expedition to crush the final resistance in Syria and also to teach the Parthians a lesson. It's one of the grandest single musters of Roman troops in history up to that time, maybe the grandest. It's not clear what Caesar intended to finally accomplish with this campaign. He's definitely planning to conquer the Dacians on his way over in the Balkans. They've been getting very uppity lately. Plutarch says that Caesar intended to dominate the Parthians and then wheel around, up and over the Caspian Sea, take Scythia, and then hit Germany from the east, and then come back to Rome. And that may sound a little fanciful, but you have to remember that scene of Caesar standing before the statue of the conqueror of Persia himself, Alexander the Great, at age 33 or so, weeping, imagining what he might do one day. The campaign, whatever its ultimate intent, it raises a thorny question, though. Who's going to join him? Because this mission promises to be potentially bigger than the one in Gaul. He's planning to be away for 3 years at least. Gaul took him 7 years. And the Gallic Wars had made a whole generation of young officers not only experts in war and famous, but also incredibly rich. A trip to the east could be even more lucrative. Everyone remembers the astonishing wealth Sulla and Pompey brought back from the east, from lands more ancient and more civilized and richer than Gaul. There is a lot of gold in Dacia too. But more importantly, Caesar's long-standing officers from the Gallic Wars have now become Caesar's trusted men in the new structure of power and honors. The ones, that is, who proved themselves. Because Caesar was always very deliberate about demonstrating to people that he believed in merit for the talented and not just the well-born. And the energetic young men at Rome have seen this in action, and they're all scrambling to get appointed to his officer corps for a chance to show him what they've got. Caesar's signing them up left and right. But very interestingly, Caesar declines to bring along many of his established mid-career talent from the nobility. Among his top commanders, really his best talent, Mark Antony is supposed to stay in Rome as consul. Decimus is detailed to Cisalpine Gaul, as we've said, northern Italy, as a governor. Trebonius is going to go be the governor of Asia, Asia Minor, for example. Additionally, the other Brutus and Cassius are supposed to stay in Rome as praetors. And, the last case there is a little conspicuous, because Cassius is the most accomplished commander around who's actually operated against the Parthians in Syria. Maybe Caesar thought that all these guys had enough glory. It was time to train up a new generation of loyal officers to steward Rome and its empire. Plus, he needed reliable men in the peacetime provinces. He must have figured they would all understand. And he's also hoping that this Parthian campaign will be an opportunity for his promising nephew to shine a little. In December 45, he sends the 18-year-old Octavius to join his advanced forces at a base in northern Greece, and he's fixing the kid up with a military tutor, teach him the art of war. In fact, Caesar has taken a firm interest in Octavius. Perhaps knowing the uncertainty of the war, which he's been planning for a while, or also the uncertainty of his fate in Rome itself, he decided to rewrite his will in September of 45, shortly after his return from Spain. And unknown to anyone, except maybe one or two close confidants, Caesar's will specifies that on his death, Octavius is to be adopted as his son and to receive 3/4 of his fortune. The other quarter is going to go to 2 other young relatives of his. But if one of these 3 were to be dead or otherwise unable to take up their inheritance, he names Decimus Brutus as a second-degree heir. And not only that, but Decimus is to be guardian of any natural or adopted son of Caesar until they come of age. Caesar decides, though, not to put his new natural son by Cleopatra in the will. Ptolemy Caesar, or Caesarion, as his nickname went, Little Caesar. First of all, it's against Roman law for a non-citizen to inherit property from a Roman citizen. He also can't adopt or formally recognize a non-citizen as son, and Caesarion, of course, isn't a citizen. In time, maybe, the boy can learn Roman ways, prove himself in Roman ways. And once he's legally of age, Caesar can arrange for him to be made a citizen. But it would take time. And even in the best circumstances, it would be controversial. For now, willing a future pharaoh anything at this stage would not only be illegal and irresponsible, it would bring all kinds of venom and hatred down on the boy. I mean, it would be cruel. Perhaps something could be figured out for his baby boy. For now, Caesar staying alive is the child's best hope. It's clear one way or another, Caesar decides from where he is standing, Octavius is currently the best choice for his heir. And this choice between Caesarion and Octavius, it's intimately tied to another colossal dilemma that Caesar's facing. Another circle he's trying to square over and above the irreconcilable poles of monarchy and republic. Because Caesar is being given quasi-divine honors. In the Spanish triumphal procession, his attendants carried a statue of him made of ivory, an honor that's usually reserved for the gods. A new statue of him is commissioned and installed in the temple of Quirinus, the deified Romulus, right next to the cult image of Romulus, or Quirinus. So what does that mean? And then in early 44, the Senate votes to dedicate a temple with a priest, a sacred couch, and a cult name to Caesar himself, Divus Julius, the deified Julius. Now, it's not at all clear that Caesar proposed or arranged any of this himself, but there's no denying, amidst the countless honors being proposed to him by everyone from well-wishers to malicious flatterers, most of which he refused, these are a few that he does nothing to stop. And you'd be tempted to see this divine honor stuff as vanity, hubris, his power getting to his head. Caesar does love his honors after all. But consider for a moment. As a true Roman, bred in the rationalizing philosophy of Epicurus, Caesar surely has no doubts. He is but a man. He has, however, been consorting with Cleopatra, who, like most of the Hellenistic monarchs, was worshipped as a god in her own domain. Then he saw with his own eyes in Egypt and elsewhere The Greek rulers of the East faced the problem of cultivating loyalty over large, ethnically diverse territories, and they solved this problem by allowing their subjects to honor them as divinities, the gods' chosen embodiment on earth. Demetrius the Besieger, Antiochus, and the Seleucids of Syria, the Ptolemies of Egypt. And of course, the paradigm case for all of this is Alexander the Great himself. And for the people participating in these ruler cults, we're not just talking about benighted barbarian subjects, but sophisticated cosmopolitan Greek tastemakers who saw this as the norm. In the East, it was almost inconceivable now that there could be a successful monarch without a ruler cult. And how much more sprawling and variegated was the totality of Roman possessions than these little kingdoms, many of which Rome ruled directly now. Caesar's already gotten a taste of this ruler cult thing personally a bit. After Pharsalus, some of the eastern cities started worshiping him as a god and savior of the cosmos. And he recently recognized the principle, at least in Rome itself, for someone else, by having a golden statue of Cleopatra erected in his new Temple of Venus. Now, on the one hand, the Romans themselves saw the success of their state thus far as intimately bound up with their scrupulous observance of the higher sacral order of the heavens. As Pontifex Maximus, Caesar knows this intimately. And not just the priesthoods, but even the magistracies had religious functions. The consuls make sacrifices before entering the Senate. They take the auspices before official meetings, and on and on. But there's no mistaking a Roman in Rome as anything but a man, fully human, and not more than that. Caesar knows that a divine cult of himself is politically a very dangerous thing in Rome. And considering the portrait of him that we've been portraying up to this point, you have to wonder, why would Caesar walk down that trail if he didn't perceive a serious practical need for it? In short, he's faced with the question of what sort of religious role should be played by a Roman monarch who refused the title of king, yet governed in an unmistakably kingly way, at least in the eyes of Rome's distant subjects. As God, as man, something in between, what is he? It's not like Caesar was eager to invent more problems for himself. This was a question brought on quite pressingly by the circumstances he had brought about, and it couldn't be ignored. The unity of the empire was at stake. And Gundulph makes some interesting observations about the nascent cult of Caesar. From his Mantle of Caesar again, quote, "No doubt there was some flattery involved in this worship, but flattery did not create it. For Caesar himself, for his Greek subjects, his divine genius might be a sufficient reason for his power. He sought to justify himself in the eyes of Romans by his descent from Venus and his arrogation of countless dignities. But when he was touched in Egypt by the magic of the East, the Roman efficiency seemed too narrow for him, and the Alexandrian bursting of all limitations and the desire for unconditional dignity, which should save time and effort in the execution of his immense plans, began to ferment within him. Tired of petty frictions, he had transcended the victories of the Republic, too great to breathe freely as a pontifex, consul, censor, dictator, even as imperator, and yet only these forms could hallow and safeguard him at Rome." End quote. On the one hand, Caesar is a prodigiously human person. He is just like every other man, only more so. He has great appetites for adventure, glory, power, yes. But he's also the most magnetic citizen Rome has ever produced. The same quality in him, the wit, the glance, the forcefulness, the achievement, the technical mastery, the care and attentiveness to individual people, the intuition for what every particular man wants, what every particular woman wants. This is the quality that attracts his soldiers, his officers, his fellow citizens to him. He doesn't just make every person feel seen, like when he's with you, you're the only person he's interested in. He is one of those rare people who makes you feel like life itself is richer, like your very being is capable of more than you thought, because somehow, incredibly, you are made of the same stuff that he is. And paradoxically, there are some encounters with such a supremely human specimen, which at the same time make you suppose that there is some higher power in the universe, even if you'd usually be the sort to say that that was nonsense. As Gundalf puts it, deification means a worship of the universal forces as they are appreciated, a worship of the concentration in a figure of the mystery of life. So is it so strange, then, that so many minds not hardened to think otherwise might spontaneously offer worship to such a man when he has so plainly proven by his exaltation to supreme authority that this aura you once felt in his presence was no illusion, but the manifestation of some strange, active, and very real power that governs human affairs? Faith in the gods, at least among the Roman elites, has been declining for a long time, and it's likely been in free fall during the Civil War. Cicero was highly skeptical that the gods even existed, or at least that they mattered for life. But perhaps the Romans' faith and hope needed to be renewed. Caesar knows he's no shining example of piety, and the irony of he himself ushering in a religious renewal, well, that can't have been lost on him. And moreover, Caesar is just the sort of man to quietly dismiss the portentous feelings of his adulators with a benevolent smile. But for him, the situation does pose a real practical problem of how to present himself. It is the choice between being the first man in Rome or divine ruler, a choice also between republic and empire, between Latin specificity and Greek cosmopolis, between city-state and world kingdom. And maybe most of all, this was the promise of the Parthian campaign. Some time to think, to process it all. What had just happened? What had he done? What had he become exactly? And to whom? But in light of this perplexity, and in retrospect, it seems a singular act of inspired genius that he followed his instincts and chose, for now, Octavius as his successor. The pressure the first man is under now, to skip all the halting steps, the testing, the give and take, and immediately to jump into being an outright god king, is both overwhelming and politically suicidal at Rome. It would arguably constitute a sin against the very gods who raised him up. It is hard to imagine Cleopatra's divine son navigating this tension very well, without knowing the boy better at least. But Octavius, Caesar could tell, I think, was a cool-blooded Roman. And Caesar seems to have detected in him that savvy and patience that would ultimately require to come up with the uniquely Roman solution to this very problem in that strange institution of the imperial cult. That is a story that we'll save for the life of Octavius when we cover his public career, which was about to begin so much sooner than anyone expected. Rome is getting to be oppressive to Caesar. There are no opinion polls or surveys in Rome, but still it's becoming clear enough that either a substantial portion of the general public or men skilled at manipulating public opinion are not ready to be content with the new status quo that he's negotiating. After Caesar's re-entry and his Spanish triumph, he laid down his consulship and appointed 2 men to succeed him in the office of consul. There's Trebonius, who we've mentioned already, and there was a guy named Fabius. And one day when he entered the theater, the consul Fabius, to his great embarrassment, was booed for apparently no other reason than that he held the consulship, and the people thought he held it illegitimately, that he didn't deserve it. This may have had something to do with the fact that elections are either now a meaningless formality or not even happening. We don't even know the details of how magistrates were picked in these months or, on every specific occasion. But either way, the common people's opinion clearly matters less now, and they resent this loss of one of the only privileges they had for meaningful participation and recognition in politics. Well, after that embarrassing event, one morning, Fabius suddenly dies, and it happened to be the last day of December, the last day of his office. And so Caesar appoints another mid-ranking loyalist of his, Rebilius, to hold the office for the rest of the term, that is less than 24 hours. Nothing bad occurred when he was consul, Cicero quipped of Rebilius. For his vigilance was so incredible that throughout his entire term of office, he never went to sleep. Hilarious, I know. But the other consul, Trebonius, is noticeably irritated under the circumstances. It's understandable. The great prize he sought his whole life, from his passing of the Lex Trebonia as tribune to extend Caesar's Gallic command, to fighting for his commander brilliantly in Gaul in the Civil War, the consulship, the greatest office in the world, is suddenly the butt of jokes, the object of booze and scorn. Early in the new year, in January 44, Caesar is sitting on the magnificent platform in front of his new temple of Venus, in his new forum, conducting all sorts of business, when he hears that the whole Senate is coming to greet him, because they just voted him another smorgasbord of honors. So much work to do, he must have thought. Will this flattery ever end? But when they arrive, maybe 200 men, all solemnly processing in their flowing togas, and they announce their offering to Caesar, he makes a joke. Friends, I need to have my honors cut back rather than increased. And he stays sitting, which to the Romans was very bad etiquette, to say the least. After the senators walk away, embarrassed, Trebonius approaches him, looking frazzled, like he can't believe what just happened. "Caesar, you have dishonored the Senate." And Caesar looks at him, as if studying him, and says nothing. Then afterwards, the story circulated, probably coming from Caesar himself, that he was feeling ill that day, some sort of illness that makes standing up a bad idea. And maybe it was true, but the PR damage, he must have realized, was serious. Caesar's eager to get out of town and let things consolidate in his absence, hopefully. He sets the date for his departure from Rome to the east to March 18th, 3 days after the Ides, which are on the 15th. There are just a few more strikes he has to land before he leaves. But later that January, the Senate tries another honor, and this time Caesar lets it land. Perhaps it was his idea this time. They vote him the dictatorship in perpetuity, dictator perpetuo. Already in 46, they voted him the dictatorship for the next 10 years. He would probably be back by then from his campaign, so why make it in perpetuity? Now, I suppose it's because Caesar, before leaving, was thinking that ambiguity is what often leads to conflict. And he was realizing there was potential for a lot of conflict in his extended absence. On the one hand, someone might orchestrate some kind of legal coup, raise an army. Dictatorship in perpetuity, also, a lawyer might argue, gave him the right to appoint people to offices in advance, beyond the limit of his current tenure office, for the year 30 BC, for example. So maybe that was useful. But probably more importantly, the mere idea of a definite term limit gave Republican dreamers the excuse to refuse to adjust to the new order he was building, as though they could just wait him out. But Rome's future is not ambiguous in Caesar's eyes, and he decided now was the time to rip off the Band-Aid. He knows it's not going to be popular, that many might hate him, but in his view, there was no other way Rome could really function anymore. As Machiavelli noted, it is good for the prince, when he has to take drastic measures, to do his injuries all up front and let the bad flavor pass away quickly, replaced by the many benefits that you'll string out over a long period after that. And anyway, Sulla didn't have a term limit on his dictatorship either. And once Caesar is back, once the Republic is finally ready for it, firmed up in its new order, who knows, maybe he could lay aside his dictatorship too. But you wonder, if Caesar, accustomed to military life as he was now, after some 15 years straight of nearly constant campaigning, is he just too used to moving fast? It was his speed that gave him the greatest advantage over his enemies, his lightning-fast chain of command that gave him the efficiency to outmaneuver everyone. But how fast can you transform an ancient republic? Well, he just has to make it to the 18th of March. And Caesar is still very eager to remind people that he's not a king, and he doesn't intend to be. But that isn't enough to stop crafty men from orchestrating PR stunts for themselves by suggesting that he does want to be king. And one morning, a diadem is found tied around the forehead of a statue of Caesar in the Forum, in the rostra, the speaker's platform. It's a plain, elegant white ribbon that was the symbol of royalty for the Hellenistic kings. Clear suggestion, right, that Caesar wants to be king. Then two of the tribunes, Marullus and Flavius are their names, they ostentatiously climb up and they remove the ribbon. Well, look at that. Two tyrant-toppling champions of the people. How brave. Caesar is strongly convinced that these tribunes have arranged to have the diadem tied up themselves just so that they could use this charade to score some points with the disaffected. He sees what's happening. He's angry, but he doesn't do anything about it. And then a few days later, when Caesar is in the parade on his way back from the Latin festival, which the Romans celebrate on a mountain a few miles from town, someone in the crowd at the Appian Gate, the drunkard in Napoleon's opinion, shouts out to Caesar, "Rex!" as in, "Hail King!" And then other people join in, "Rex, Rex, Rex!" And Caesar smiles patiently and he corrects them. "Not king, but Caesar. Non Rex, said Caesar." But then, these same two busybody, clout-hunting tribunes find the gentleman from the crowd who first said Rex, and they arrest him. And Caesar at this point just knows this is a setup. He's got his sources, and he's had enough. And he accuses Marullus and Flavius of abusing their office and deliberately trying to stir up resentment against him. And the tribunes fire back. They circulate a declaration that they feel threatened in the exercise of their office. Caesar is creating an unsafe work environment. There's a power dynamic, you might say. Well, Caesar calls a meeting of the Senate. Some of his supporters shout out and call for the death penalty for these tribunes. But Caesar quiets them down. He speaks, he says, more in sadness than in anger. He dismisses the death penalty as abhorrent. But he says that although he'd like to use his usual clemency, there's an issue of his dignity to uphold, and so he moves to have the tribunes expelled from the office and ousted from the Senate. And so they are. This is especially painful to him because he's always portrayed himself as the champion of the people, and the tribune's office is supposed to be the champion of the people. He cited the Optimates' abuse of the tribunes, of Mark Antony in particular, as one of the grounds for his invasion of Italy when he crossed the Rubicon. And here he is, driving these tribunes out from public life and shame. Surely those tribunes knew that it would be a big red line for him to cross, to attack tribunes, which was exactly why they felt so secure in orchestrating their little sideshow. They thought he wouldn't mess with them, which was exactly why Caesar had to do it, to avoid letting them set a precedent for other tribunes to scheme and harass the dictator. The tribune's office was a tool that he used skillfully in his own rise, but the Optimates knew how to use it too. And this incident proved that die-hard disagreeables will do it again if they have the chance. Even the tribunate is just one more vestige of that old chaotic Republican order, a final loophole that needs to be tied up and subsumed into the new chain of command. Caesar has recently arranged for the Senate to grant him the tribunician right of sacrosanctity and thereby swear to hold his body as sacred and inviolable. So it is Caesar now who is the people's champion. Much depends on this. What was also bothersome about these actions of the tribunes was not so much the probably staged calls for Caesar to take up the kingship as the source of those calls. It made the idea of kingship silly, the impulsive fantasy of yokels and tavern keepers. Plus, coming from the rabble, these calls would suggest to educated men that familiar pattern of the tyrant whipping up popular discontent to seize power from the nobles. Read Aristotle's Politics, Book 5, for example. Now in Rome, this narrative was a cheap way to manufacture resentment. Caesar wants to help people think outside of those categories. And if he was going to reject the kingship, it had to look more dignified. The famous event is depicted in Shakespeare's play. On February 15th, Mark Antony was the lead runner at the Lupercalia Festival. This is an archaic fertility celebration where, at the high point, youths run through the city wearing only a loincloth, whipping people, especially eager women, with newly flayed strips of goat skin, very holy. And at the finish line of the forum, Caesar sits in state on the platform of his newly refurbished rostra in a gilded chair, dressed in his triumphal robe, with elegant red boots and a long-sleeved tunic that evoked the image of the Alban kings of yore. When he arrives, Antony climbs up the steps of the rostra, 11 feet high, pulls out a diadem and places it on Caesar's head, and he proclaims, "The people of Rome, give this to you through me." There's a pause, and the crowd goes silent, and then Caesar takes off the diadem and hands it back to Antony. And then Antony tries again, and Caesar takes it off. And then Caesar says, "Jupiter alone is the king of the Romans." And he points up to the temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline and says, take the diadem up there. And the crowd erupts into cheers. Caesar can tell that many of the senators are not impressed with this spectacle. And it's not clear whose idea it was, but Caesar was pleased enough to play along with whatever Antony was doing. He has it written, though, in the official state records. The consul Mark Antony offered the kingship by the people's command to the dictator in perpetuity, Gaius Caesar, but Caesar refused. And by the people's command here might be a reference to the army. It's not clear. There doesn't seem to have been an assembly vote or anything like that for this. But either way, with this public gesture, what better way to communicate that the kingship was his to refuse and not some tribune's to withhold from him? Yet, it seems like this gesture, he was rejecting the kingship, that it wasn't enough to allay concerns. Rumors are circulating about Caesar wanting to move the capital of the empire to Ilion, that is, Troy, the birthplace of his ancestor and the ancestor of the Roman people, Aeneas, or to Alexandria, still the world's most impressive city for now, home of Caesar's divine concubine. It's ridiculous dinner party blabbering, and it was hard to stamp out. And there are also rumors about threats to Caesar's life circulating. Names are brought to him. Antony and Dolabella are plotting against you. Brutus and Cassius are plotting against you. And Caesar supposedly said, "I am not afraid of these fat, long-haired fellows," meaning Antony and Dolabella, "but rather of those pale, thin ones," meaning Brutus and Cassius. And friends urge him to beef up his security with a bodyguard troop, even in the city. They volunteer for the roles. Think of what's at stake. Caesar's been getting warnings about attempts on his life for a long time. In fact, the sheer glut of action-demanding information coming to his desk right now is enough to make a normal man curl up into a corner and cry. The level of focus, filtering, prioritization, and speed of judgment all this requires is nearly superhuman. It's got to be hard to sort out the noise from the signal when it comes to threats like this. And Caesar has got to be thinking, any potential assassin surely must realize what kind of bloody chaos would certainly ensue if Caesar dies right now. But he may have suspected some of those threats were credible. But he waves off this idea of keeping domestic bodyguards. Every gesture of his is being scrutinized, and everything he's built depends on him keeping a very delicate balance in his public image. Bodyguards are the stuff of tyrants, Pisistratus, Dionysius. It's a classic playbook. Most importantly, it wasn't the Roman way. When Sulla laid down the dictatorship, he strolled through the forum without a guard. Caesar tells his friends, "It's better to die once and for all than to live always expecting death." And perhaps, deep down in his heart, even though he knows the extent of the invisible resentment, and he can feel it, Caesar just didn't like to think about how much many people whose support he needed hated him. Plus, quite simply, bodyguards train you to let your guard down. They weaken you, or they train you to live in fear, and fear is weakness too, and once you give into it, you embolden your enemies even more. And anyway, can't a bodyguard who gets bribed kill you just as well as anyone? Caesar was a man who loved risk. He thrived on it. It's how he got to where he was, putting his trust in fortune, in Gaul, at the Rubicon, at Pharsalus, Egypt, Spain, so many places. He's not about to stop being Julius Caesar now. Rumors keep coming in about plots. Caesar's had enough of this. He tells his associates, anyone else bringing reports about assassination attempts is going to face consequences. He doesn't want to hear it. He tells them to issue a public statement that Caesar knows about the schemes, about the night meetings, about the poets composing abusive verses. He knows. If that wasn't enough to scare or stop them, if the Rome he had saved from herself, who depended on him now, above all, for her safety and stability, was that determined to get rid of him, well, how much could he do? He needs to focus on his own business, and his men should too. March 14th, 44 BC, was the last night Gaius Julius Caesar spent on Earth. In 4 days, he was planning to set out from Rome to join his legions for the great expedition against the Parthians. We're well informed about the last night from many ancient sources. After a busy day of hearing cases, decision-making, finalizing plans, he goes to dinner at the house of his friend Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, the future triumvir. Lepidus and Caesar go way back. The man was 10 years younger than Caesar, a noble from an ancient line. His father was the man who raised the revolt in 78 after the death of Sulla, which Caesar sympathized with, but declined the invitation to join. Caesar and Lepidus have both been in the College of Pontiffs for most of their adult lives together. Lepidus is competent enough, he's organized, but he's not overly ambitious. He's not a great soldier, but he's a devoted friend. Lepidus is one of the many men who would be little to nothing without Caesar. But under Julius Caesar, he's risen to great prominence. He's been very useful, and now he's the master of the horse, that is, second in command after the dictator. And Caesar, I imagine, felt especially safe at the house of Lepidus, and they're joined that evening by other good friends. There are 9 seats at a typical Roman banquet. Caesar's got to be constantly thinking about spending time in turn with all the people that he's got to count on, especially the men who are going to be staying behind at Rome in his absence. Only 8 seats to fill. He's got to keep a good rotation. For this dinner, he brings along Decimus Brutus. Was it because he felt Decimus wavering a little bit, seeming a little sullen? Did he notice Decimus acting a little strange at dinner, a bit reserved, or rather, a bit too eager to seem cheerful? The evening gets started and goes on. After food, the drinking comes. It was a shame the other Brutus wasn't there, Marcus Junius or Cassius, because the conversation turned philosophical, and those men were serious amateurs. Brutus in the academic school, Cassius in the Epicureans, like Caesar. Both of those absent men were, after all, Lepidus's brothers-in-law. Cassius and Lepidus were both married to Marcus Junius Brutus's sisters. It's amazing to think of it. And as was the custom in those days, Caesar has to mix his pleasure with business. During the conversation, his aides keep bringing in official letters that they've prepared for him to glance over and sign personally at the bottom with his greeting. And over, he's writing the usual tag, Vale, Vale, Vale. Farewell, farewell, farewell. At some point, Caesar speaks up to propose a new topic. And I swear I'm not making this up. He asks, what is the best sort of death? The philosophers offer many opinions on this, after all. And the men go around, various answers are given, and then it's Caesar's turn, and he weighs in. Caesar has read in Xenophon's Education of Cyrus, that famous portrait of the first king of Persia, how Cyrus the Great, in his long, final illness, gave all sorts of directions for his funeral. But Caesar abhorred the idea of a lingering, slow end like this. Better, he said, that death should come swift and sudden and unexpected. The conversation was good that evening, weighty, poignant, memorable. the sort that makes you want to pour another round and savor it. As the dinner concludes, Caesar leaves to retire, later than usual that evening, to his house. It's still the Domus Publica, the official residence of the Pontifex Maximus. The house where Clodius had his famous escapade with Caesar's prior wife at the Bona Dea festival. Tonight, his current wife of 15 years, the faithful Calpurnia, is probably waiting up for him. Across the river, at his other villa on the Janiculum, Cleopatra was surely asleep by now with their little son, Caesarion. Looking over to the other side of the forum, he can see the spot where the old Senate house used to sit, burned down in Clodius's violent funeral, and torn down now. And next to it, still under construction, was the new Senate house, the Curia Julia, that he was erecting with the spoils of his Gallic campaigns. The Senate was convening tomorrow on the Ides, but that would happen over in the Campus Martius, in its current meeting place, the grand room off the portico of Pompey's monumental complex next to his theater. How the forum had changed since Caesar was his son's age. It was indeed becoming a city of marble. How many bills had he pushed through in raucous assemblies here? How many battles had been fought, political, physical? How much blood had been spilled on these pavers? Surely there was hope now that no more knives would be drawn in the forum, no more senators marching out from the Curia to club to death populist leaders with broken bench legs, murder them with roof tiles, the Gracchi, Saturninus, the many friends of Marius and Cinna. Surely no more proscription lists would be posted here, no more heads of Roman dignitaries presented for their reward. In the middle of the night, Caesar and Calpurnia are roused from their sleep by a violent spring wind throwing the windows and doors of their bedroom open. Caesar gets up and shuts them, reassures her. Calpurnia was having a bad dream, but he's having trouble sleeping too. After a late night of drinking, the conversations of the evening swirl in your mind and pass into your dreams. Slow death, sudden death. Did Caesar see Cyrus, Epicurus, or Pompey, Labienus, Cato, Decimus, and Lepidus? His troubled thoughts are still on his mind when first light comes and the two wake up. Calpurnia reports her dream to Caesar. She dreamed of their house. The Senate has lately authorized Caesar to erect a pediment over their front porch, as though the house were a temple befitting a god. But in this dream, the pediment collapsed as Calpurnia stood before it, and she looked down to find her husband in her arms, his body lifeless, streaming with blood. She reminds him of the prophecy of Spurina, the Etruscan seer who read the entrails for Caesar at the Lupercalia on February 15th. The soothsayer foresaw a great danger for Caesar over the next 30 days. "Caesar," Calpurnia begs him, "don't go to the Senate meeting today." Caesar takes this to heart. He's made a habit of ignoring omens, but he's not feeling right. He goes ahead and makes a quick morning errand, only a block or so away, and he visits the house of his friend Domitius Calvinus, a key man in his Pharsalus campaign, and he makes a routine sacrifice to Jupiter. To his surprise there, his friend, this very Spurina the soothsayer, is in attendance, and he jokes with Spurina. The 30 days are up. The Ides of March have come. Spurina nods. Aye, they have come, but they have not gone. Caesar gets back home and orders new sacrifices conducted, new omens read, to please the jittery Calpurnia. The omens are bad, and reports are coming in of strange sightings over the last few hours, birds acting oddly, weird lights in the sky, the sound of clashing weapons. Very well. It's enough for a good excuse to take the morning off and get some rest for his health. He orders Mark Antony to go and dismiss the Senate. Caesar will not be attending. Later that morning, however, Decimus arrives. Caesar greets him. The two old soldiers chat among the marble statues and mosaics in the courtyard garden of the house of the Pontifex. Now Decimus has heard Caesar wants to dismiss the Senate meeting, But Caesar is working so hard to keep the Senate feeling dignified. This might be construed as an insult. Seeing as how these weighty gentlemen all cleared their schedules, Decimus reminds his old commander of all the important business on the agenda, including Antony's attempts to block Caesar's appointment of Dolabella as consul during the upcoming absence. Also, there's that rumor that they both know about, how one of the priests is going to present some Sibylline prophecy that the Parthians can only be conquered by a king, and thereby this priest is supposed to propose Caesar preserve the title of dictator in Rome, but be given the title of king out in the provinces. This was an absurd rumor. That wasn't going to happen. But Caesar, after all, does have a duty to allay the concerns. And furthermore, Decimus has heard that Caesar's rationale for his absence is some portents that he's seen. What's this? The man who once laughed at bad omens and charged ahead to victory against his enemies in Spain, now he's caving to superstition? Caesar then shares with Decimus Calpurnia's bad dream. "What are you saying, Caesar?" Decimus responds. "Will a man of your stature ask the Senate to reconvene and wait until your wife has had better dreams?" I suppose Decimus's words may have been a little like a cold shower. Decimus was a savvy man. You don't get to be Caesar's heir in the second degree, guardian of his future children, without good judgment and winning words. Perhaps, Caesar thought, time to man up, face what must be faced. Caesar has traveled much harder roads in much worse condition on many a campaign. Was his sense of foreboding, of heightened risk, something that he had to put aside to rationalize away? Or was it perhaps that Caesar decided to go to the Senate meeting, not because he convinced himself that it was safe, but precisely that he felt it was dangerous, because he was attracted to danger? You have to be to do all that he did. Let the die be cast. Caesar and Decimus set out for the Campus Martius. As usual, he's accompanied by his 24 lictors, a great entourage of Roman public officials, a fawning crowd of citizens, foreigners, and slaves. As usual, people with desperate hopes of getting their various petitions heard, great and small, are trying to call to him for a favor, holding little papyrus scrolls, hoping to get their requests before his attention. He grabs them and passes them on to his secretaries and attendants walking alongside him in the crowd. One man manages to push through and get close. Caesar recognizes him, Artemidorus, a young dignitary from the Greek city of Cnidos in Asia. Caesar knew him through his father, who served him as a diplomat. In fact, Caesar stayed with this Artemidorus when he visited Cnidos. The kid was a devotee of philosophy, a serious youth. Wasn't he connected with Brutus now? Artemidorus hands Caesar a rolled-up letter. "Caesar, you must read this yourself, and do it urgently. Now, if you can." The man looks concerned. Caesar nods. But I imagine that from Artemidorus' tone and urgency, Caesar knows what it's probably about. He keeps this one in his hand, maybe for a boring lull in the proceedings in the upcoming Senate meeting. So close did Julius Caesar come to discovering the trap he was walking into. Gaius Julius Caesar arrives at the portico of Pompey. There are the senators, all waiting outside. They offer deferent gestures of greeting, more than 200 men. There is Lepidus, Hirtius, Pansa, Dolabella, top guys. Over here are Brutus and Cassius, praetors by Caesar's favor, soon to head off to prestigious governorships that he's arranged for them. And there's Trebonius. Wealthy Asia will soon be in good hands under him. There are the Casca brothers. Tilius Cimber, easy to spot, his face permanently flushed. Was that man ever sober? He was going to have a great time running luxurious Bithynia for the next 5 years. All of Caesar's governors were going to hold 5-year offices. They had it made. Caesar takes care of his people. And here was Minucius Basileus and Galba, who fought for him at Gaul in the Alps. There's old Cicero, the soul of the Senate. And Quintus Ligarius, shifting around the crowd. Amazing that Cicero convinced Caesar to pardon him. As he walks up, Popilius Lina approaches him with some petition. It never ends. And Caesar tells him he'll do his best, dismisses him with a smile and a pat, and he walks on to the soothsayers. The soothsayers sacrifice and read the omens as usual. They are not auspicious. Do it again, Caesar says. They do. Still bad. Caesar says, we've kept the conscript fathers waiting long enough. Let's get on with it. The signal is given, and all start to file in. The lictors form up at attention outside the door. Only senators allowed in the meeting. No guards, no weapons, of course. As he walked in, did he notice Trebonius pulling Mark Antony over to talk to him about some pressing matter outside the doorway? The dictator makes his way down the center aisle, flanked by the ascending rows of benches on either side, and steps at last onto his tribunal platform. Did he pause to look at the statue of his old friend, Pompey the Great, standing guard over the tribunal in this great complex that bore his name? Perhaps they could hear, even inside that room, the shouts of the huge crowds in Pompey's theater next door. There were gladiatorial games going on just at this moment. Caesar sits down on his gilded chair, wearing his dark red triumphal toga, embroidered with gold. But before he can get to that scroll from Artemidorus, still in hand, several senators approach his seat, led by Tillius Cimber. Tillius begins to speak. He draws very close. What's this? No smell of wine on his breath today? He starts pleading about his brother, still in exile over his service to the Optimates in the Civil War. But Cimber must be more serious this time because he's brought along some friends to boost his petition. Cassius, Brutus, Casca, Basileus, and Decimus, an odd grouping. But maybe Caesar was pleased to see old enemies now become friends under his watch. They surround Caesar's chair. Cimber keeps pleading. Cimber, my friend, we've spoken about your brother. Now's not the time. Please, Caesar, there is a matter you haven't considered. Cimber, enough. The other men draw close too. They start to speak up. Please, Caesar, please. They take Caesar's hand and kiss it, fawning on him, kissing his head, touching his toga. Bizarre self-abasement. Oh, Caesar, Cimber is wailing. He grabs Caesar's toga. Caesar's had enough of this. He tries to stand up in disgust, but Cimber pulls him back down to his seat by his toga. A flash of shock. Something is wrong. Cimber yanks again at the toga and rips it off Caesar's shoulder. Caesar looks toward the other senators in the room. He shouts out to them, "This is violence!" The senators turn toward the ruckus at the tribunal. Cicero, from the benches, falls silent and gazes on, stunned. It's remarkable to note that throughout all of his campaigns, so exquisitely well documented as they are, there is no mention of Julius Caesar ever receiving a wound. He was, quite possibly, an unblemished victim. It was in that moment of surprise that he felt the first blow, a glancing stab to his collarbone. He grabs the knife, stabs the arm holding it with his stylus, and turns around and sees his friend. "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Casca cries, "Brother, help!" Caesar grabs Casca and hurls him from the tribunal. But just as he is mid-throw, he feels another stab land in his side, deep between the ribs. Caesar shouts in pain, whirls around to see Casca's brother. And now he realizes every man standing around him is armed with a dagger. He tries to defend himself, extricate himself, but it's no use. They're surrounding him, clawing at him, stabbing. Cassius appears before him, looks him straight in the eye, and slashes him across the face. Here is Galba, Basileus, his old comrades in arms, murder in their eyes, and Quintus Ligarius, spared like Cassius, only to bury his dagger in his benefactor. The stabs keep flying, and then he sees Decimus Brutus. Decimus, his own protege, his heir. Was it this business, then, that Decimus was so intent on this morning? Decimus steps up to the sacrifice and drives his dagger deep, just under Caesar's ribs, a cold, soldierly blow. At last, Marcus Junius Brutus approaches. How many nights had Caesar and Servilia whispered to each other about young Marcus, his excellent qualities, his promising career? How often did Caesar reassure her nervous heart, told her, "Trust me, everything will be fine for Brutus." "You too, child," he says. Brutus, the philosopher, thrusts his dagger into Caesar's body. Wheeling and shaking from the adrenaline, from the 23 knife blows, Caesar sinks to the floor next to the statue of Pompey the Great. Pompey also died from the knife of one of his own soldiers. And like Pompey, Caesar pulls his toga over his face in his final moments to cover with modesty that horrific look he knows will be frozen on it very shortly. As his life drained out, the room was filled with the sound of shouts and panic, men fleeing the Senate house. And perhaps he was still conscious when the last man exited the room, leaving him to lie silent, abandoned, all alone. What did Caesar's mind turn to in his final moments? Calpurnia, the faithful wife, right all along? Cleopatra, she was in trouble. Was there any hope for their young son? What about Octavius, far off in Greece? What about Rome? So many things left undone, undecided. But how does a mind like Caesar's finally encounter the fact that for once, truly, finally, there was nothing more he could do but rest? It was an eventful day after that in Rome, but no more in Pompey's Senate. Everyone is afraid to go near, to touch him. Even his friends have fled. Who knows what violence the assassins might have in store for anyone seen giving honor to the body of the dictator? Finally, after the square clears and no one is in sight, 3 of his slaves cautiously come out of hiding, look around, and slowly make their way into the Senate house. They carefully lift their master's body and place it in a litter as a storm starts to roll in. It usually takes 4 men to carry a litter, but they could not find a 4th willing to carry home the man who just that morning ruled the world. So they struggle slowly back to his house in the Forum, stopping frequently for breaks, taking turns carrying the heavier side, stumbling in the rain. They leave the curtain open, and Caesar's hand hangs down lifeless from the side. Crowds start to gather along the way. They look inside and see the face of Rome's greatest man and the wound Cassius made on it, and many weep. And so Julius Caesar made it home for the last time to Calpurnia as the riot fires were lit. Fully man, and perhaps nothing more. The mortal soul of Gaius Julius Caesar was gone from the earth. It was not clear at that moment, although we know now, that Caesar did not die in vain. For good or ill, he had irreversibly changed the destiny of his people, of great foreign nations whose name no Roman had ever heard of whole continents yet to be discovered. As great as his intellect, his will, and his imagination were, how could he or anyone alive then fathom the magnitude of his work and the mysterious hidden juggernaut of providence that he unwittingly piloted, even for so short a time? After his final victory at Munda, the Senate had declared him father of the fatherland, parens patriae. If it's possible for any man, then I think it seems fair to say it of Gaius Julius Caesar, that he loved his country, and not just in the abstract. Could we even propose that he loved his people? Not like the demagogue who sees the crowd as a fickle woman to be wooed, but like a father who may hope for love in return, yes, but who above all wishes to see his children flourish and excel. Caesar believed not just in his own destiny, but in the destiny of Rome. He had a will to rule and to do it well, and he sought to encourage in her the will to do the same. When you consider it from that perspective, despite all of his faults and mistakes, and Rome's too, it is hard to say that Caesar failed. The full story of what happened after Caesar's assassination we leave for the lives of Brutus, Cicero, Antony, and Octavius, the men who steered the ship of history in the aftermath. And stay tuned for a brief wrap-up episode coming soon, in which we'll discuss, in brief, the events in the wake of his death, the man's last will and testament, my sources, and some further reading, as well as some lessons that we can all take from one of world history's all-time greats. But, for now, let us render unto Caesar what is his. Ave, Caesar. Farewell, farewell. May we meet again. Thanks for listening. Stay strong, stay ancient. This is Alex Petkus. Until next time.